There is a wall at Kew Gardens that has been standing since 1820. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance. They are too busy looking at the palm house, or the Japanese pagoda, or the endless green that rolls out in every direction like a rumpled velvet cloth. But if you stop and look at that wall, really look, you will see it is almost completely consumed by a wisteria vine so old that its trunk is thicker than a man's forearm. Its roots go down into ground that remembers things most people have forgotten. Its branches have watched coronations announced and mourned. They have felt the particular hush that falls over a garden when something important is about to happen. On the morning of July 9th, 2024, that hush came again. It did not arrive with sirens or motorcycle outriders. It did not come with a press convoy or a red carpet rolled out across the gravel path. It came the way most important things come, quietly, without warning, in the shape of a plain, dark car that pulled up to the staff entrance on Kew Road and stopped without ceremony. The door opened. A boy stepped out. He was wearing a light blue shirt, slightly untucked on the left side. He had a canvas bag over one shoulder, the kind you get free at a conference and never throw away. And he was squinting slightly against the morning sun the way anyone does when they have just come from somewhere dim and cool into somewhere bright and open. He looked around at the garden with the expression of someone who is genuinely trying to get their bearings, not performing the act of getting their bearings for an audience. His name was Prince George Alexander Louis. He was 10 years old, and he had not been asked, but asked himself to spend 3 weeks of his summer holiday at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, helping to prepare seed specimens for the Millennium Bank Partnership, a global conservation project that exists to protect the world's plant species against extinction. He had not told many people. That had been the arrangement. Inside the staff entrance, a small group of Kew employees had gathered, not the whole department, just the ones whose work would overlap with George's over the coming days. There was James Ocaffer, a junior seed technician who was 26 and trying very hard not to look as nervous as he felt. There was Priya Nair, the collections coordinator, who had prepared a laminated visitor badge and then spent 10 minutes wondering whether a prince needed a visitor badge, and then decided that yes, a visitor badge was a visitor badge. There was a facilities manager named Colin who was there because someone had told him to be there, and he was not entirely sure why but was committed to seeing it through. And there was Dr. Helena Marsh. Dr. Marsh was standing slightly apart from the others, the way a person stands when they want it known that they are present out of professional obligation and not personal enthusiasm. She was 61 years old. She had worked at Kew for 32 years. She had a PhD in seed morphology from Edinburgh, a second publication record that most university professors would envy, and a manner that one junior colleague had once privately described as the human equivalent of a closed sign. She was holding a clipboard. She watched the boy walk toward them across the gravel, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was going to be a long 3 weeks. George shook hands with each of them in turn. When he reached Dr. Marsh, he looked up at her. She was considerably taller and said, "Thank you for having me. I know this probably creates extra work." Dr. Marsh looked at him for a moment. "It does," she said. George nodded, as if this was a fair and reasonable thing to say. "I'll try not to get in the way." Dr. Marsh said nothing. She made a small mark on her clipboard and turned toward the building. The wisteria on the old wall said nothing either, but it had seen this kind of beginning before. The best ones always start a little cold. The seed preparation laboratory at Kew is not a glamorous room. It does not look the way laboratories look in films, all gleaming surfaces and dramatic lighting. It is a long, low-ceilinged room with fluorescent strip lights that hum faintly at a frequency you only notice when the room goes very quiet. The benches are worn smooth from decades of use. The equipment is precise and expensive, but not beautiful. The smell is somewhere between a library, a greenhouse, and and a freshly opened packet of soil. Not unpleasant, just specific. The smell of things being carefully preserved. Along the south wall, floor to ceiling, run the specimen drawers. There are hundreds of them, each one labeled in a small, neat font, each one containing seeds that have been cleaned and dried and cataloged, and stored with the particular devotion that people give to things they believe the world cannot afford to lose. Drawer 47 had no label. Well, it had half a label. Someone had begun to write on it years ago in pencil, and the pencil had faded to the point where the writing was more suggestion than fact. The drawer had been pulled out perhaps twice in the last 3 years, mostly by accident, by someone reaching for drawer 46 or drawer 48 and grabbing the wrong handle. Its contents have been noted in the records as uncategorized mixed specimens, origin uncertain, pre-2019 acquisition. Nobody had found the time to properly sort it. There were always more urgent things. Dr. Marsh had found the time to think about drawer 47 on the morning of George's arrival, as she stood in the car park, considering what task to assign him. She was not proud of the thought process. She would not have described it as deliberate unkindness. She would have described it as pragmatism. A royal visit in her experience followed a reliable pattern. The visitor arrived, was shown the most photogenic elements of the work, expressed polite interest, had their photograph taken beside something impressive, and then left, having absorbed approximately none of it. The real work went on before and after the visit, not during it. The real work was not photogenic. The real work was drawer 47. So drawer 47 it was. She explained this to her colleague Priya that morning, while George was being given his safety orientation by James. "I'm giving him the uncategorized drawer," she said. Priya looked at her. "Helena, that drawer is 3 years of backlog." "Yes, he's 10. Children are capable of methodical work if they are shown the method clearly," Dr. Marsh said. "If he gets bored and loses interest, that is information. If he manages to make some progress, that is also useful. Either way, the rest of us can get on with what we were already doing." Priya was quiet for a moment. "And if he's actually good at it?" Dr. Marsh made a small sound that was not quite a laugh. "Then we will cross that bridge when we come to it." She did not think they would come to it. She was a scientist. She was usually right about things. She had not yet learned, though she would, before those 3 weeks were over, that the seeds most worth finding are always the ones you have stopped expecting to find. James Ockhaffer set George up at bench 7, which was near the window and had the best natural light in the room. He laid out the tools, a magnifying loupe, a set of fine-pointed tweezers, a reference manual for seed morphology identification, a data entry tablet preloaded with the Kew cataloging template, and a small printed guide that James had made himself the night before, titled How Seeds Are Sorted, a beginner's guide, which he had then worried was condescending and had briefly considered throwing away, but which George picked up immediately and read from cover to cover before touching anything else. "This is really good," George said, holding up the printed guide. James, who had spent 45 minutes on it the previous evening, managed to say, "Oh, it's nothing," in a voice that suggested it was, in fact, not nothing. George pulled on his lab gloves. He looked at drawer 47, which James had set open on the bench in front of him. Inside, arranged with the approximate organization of a junk drawer in a busy family kitchen, were hundreds of seed packets, small glassine envelopes, some sealed properly, some folded at the top, some with handwritten labels, some with printed labels, some with no labels at all. Some were sorted into loose groups that suggested a categorization had been started and then abandoned. Others appeared to have been placed in the drawer in the same spirit one places something in a spare room, temporarily, with full intention of dealing with it properly later. George picked up the first envelope. He held it under the loupe. He looked at it for a long time. Then he opened the reference manual, found the relevant page, looked back at the seed, looked back at the manual, made a note on the tablet, set the envelope down, picked up the next one. He did not say anything. He did not ask how long this was supposed to take. He did not ask when the break was. He did not look at the door to see whether anyone was watching him, though someone was. Dr. Marsh had positioned herself at a bench near the far end of the lab, ostensibly working on her own documentation. She was, in fact, watching George over the top of her reading glasses with the focused attention of someone who has made a prediction and is waiting for the data to confirm it. At 10:47 in the morning, 22 minutes after he had begun, George leaned slightly forward over the specimen tray to get a closer look at a particularly small seed and breathed directly onto the humidity sensor mounted in the bench panel. The alarm was not loud. It was a short, sharp, three-tone pulse, the kind of sound that, in a quiet laboratory, carries approximately the same social impact as knocking a glass off a table in a silent restaurant. Every head in the room turned. George sat up straight. His ears went slightly pink. "Sorry," he said, to nobody in particular and everybody at once. James reset the sensor. "It's very sensitive," he said kindly. "It just doesn't like warm air directly on it. Just lean back a little when you're looking at the small ones." "Right," said George. "Yes, sorry." He leaned back. He picked up the next envelope. 11 minutes later, he did it again. The alarm sounded. The heads turned. George's ears went a deeper shade of pink. James reset the sensor again without comment. Colin, the facilities manager, who had stayed on well past any reasonable professional justification and was now pretending to check a pipe fitting in the corner, pressed his lips together very firmly. Dr. Marsh wrote something on her clipboard. It is not known what she wrote. She did not share it. By noon, George had successfully cataloged 31 seed specimens from drawer 47. This was, James would note privately to Priya at lunch, more than any volunteer they had ever placed at that bench on the first morning. He did not say this loudly. He said it the way you say something you are not yet ready to make official. George ate lunch in the staff room with James and Priya and a quiet man from the herbarium named Alistair who did not say very much but did push the biscuit tin toward George twice, which in British workplace culture is a significant gesture of acceptance. Dr. Marsh ate at her desk. She said she always ate at her desk. This was true. It had nothing to do with George, probably. After lunch, George went back to bench 7. He pulled on his gloves again. He opened the reference manual to the page he had bookmarked. He picked up the next envelope in drawer 47. He leaned back from the humidity sensor before he looked at it. The alarm did not sound. In the corner of the lab, Colin, the facilities manager, who had absolutely no remaining professional reason to be there, allowed himself a very small smile. It happened on the afternoon of the 5th day. By that point, George had developed what James privately thought of as a rhythm. He arrived each morning at the same time, changed into his lab coat with the focused efficiency of someone suiting up for something that mattered, and went directly to bench 7 without needing to be directed. He had cataloged 184 specimens from drawer 47. He had only triggered the humidity alarm once more since that first morning, and had immediately said, "That was me, sorry," before anyone turned to look, which the lab had collectively decided counted as growth. He had also, quietly and without making it a thing, begun to ask better questions. Not the questions of someone performing curiosity, not, "Oh, how fascinating, what does this one do?" but the questions of someone whose thinking has snagged on something specific and needs to resolve it before moving on. Questions like, why would two seeds from the same species have different coat textures? And if the origin is marked uncertain, does that mean uncertain country or uncertain collector? And once to Priya, a question about the Millennium Bank's deduplication protocol that had caused Priya to look at him for a moment, and then pull up a chair and spend 20 minutes explaining it, not because she had to, but because the question was genuinely interesting. Dr. Marsh had, by this point, relocated her primary workstation to a bench closer to the middle of the lab. She would not have described this as moving closer to George. She would have described it as needing better access to the central reference shelf. The central reference shelf was, in fact, slightly less convenient from her new position than from her original one. She had not mentioned this. On the afternoon of the fifth day, George picked up an envelope from near the bottom of drawer 47's third internal tray, the layer that nobody had reached yet, the sediment layer. The part of the drawer where things go when they have been waiting the longest. The envelope was small. The label on it was printed, not handwritten, which suggested it had come from a proper acquisition at some point, not a casual donation. But the label was wrong. Not wrong in the way of a typo or a formatting error. Wrong in the way that happens when a database entry gets duplicated and one copy gets corrected and the other one doesn't. The name on the label was Leucadendron salignum, a South African protea species, common enough in collections. But the seed inside, when George held it under the loupe, did not match the reference images for Leucadendron salignum. The shape was different. The surface texture was different. The size was slightly, but measurably different. George looked at the seed. He looked at the manual. He looked at the seed again. He did what he had learned to do when something didn't resolve cleanly. He did not assume he was wrong. He flagged it. He put the envelope to one side of the bench, separate from the cataloged specimens and the uncatalogued ones, in the space he had mentally designated for, "I need to ask about this." At 3:15 in the afternoon, during a natural pause in the lab's activity, George picked up the envelope and walked to Dr. Marsh's bench. This was the first time he had approached her directly. Their interactions until that point had been limited to brief exchanges initiated by her during her walkthroughs, and one occasion when she had corrected his grip on the tweezers without preamble and walked away before he could respond. He had adjusted his grip. He had not made a comment about it. "Dr. Marsh," he said, "I think I might have made a mistake with this one, but I'm not sure whether the mistake is mine or the label's." He set the envelope on her bench. Dr. Marsh looked at it. She picked it up. She held it under her own loupe with the automatic efficiency of someone who has done this thousands of times. And then she went very still. The particular stillness of a scientist who has just seen something that does not fit the expected result, and is rapidly, silently, recalibrating every assumption they brought into the room. She set down the loupe. She picked up the envelope again. She turned it over. She looked at the label. She looked at the seed. She opened her own reference database on her workstation, typed a search, waited, and looked at the results with an expression that George could not fully read, but that James, who had glanced over from bench 4, would later describe as the face Helena makes when she has been wrong about something and is deciding how to handle it. Leucadendron grandiflorum. The name had not appeared in a Kew acquisition log in over 20 years. The species was not extinct. The word in conservation science is rarely that final, but it had been declared regionally extinct in its native Western Cape habitat in 2019, following habitat destruction from a combination of agricultural expansion and wildfire. Live specimens were held in 2 botanical gardens globally. Seed specimens were rarer. A viable, properly stored seed specimen of Leucadendron grandiflorum, mislabeled and forgotten in a drawer that nobody had touched in 3 years, sitting in an envelope that a 10-year-old boy had pulled from the bottom tray because he was working methodically from the top down and had not skipped anything. Dr. Marsh set the envelope down on her bench very carefully. She looked at George. George looked back at her, still in the posture of someone waiting to be told what they had done wrong. "You were right," Dr. Marsh said. "The mistake is the labels." A pause. "This is Leucadendron grandiflorum." She said the name with the precise, unhurried enunciation of someone for whom Latin nomenclature is not performance but habit. "It is a protea species from the Western Cape of South Africa. It was believed to be locally extinct in the wild as of 2019. We believed our records contained no viable seed specimens. George looked at the envelope on the bench, so it was lost. It was mislabeled, Dr. Marsh said, which, in a collection of this size, is functionally the same thing. She paused, until someone finds it. Another pause, longer this time. You looked at it carefully, she said. It was not quite a compliment. It was not a compliment. It was the observation of a scientist accurately describing what had occurred. The texture was wrong, George said. I didn't know what it was. I just knew it wasn't what the label said. Dr. Marsh nodded once. She picked up her phone and made a call to the collections director. George walked back to bench 7. He picked up the next envelope in drawer 47. He held it under the loupe. He leaned back from the humidity sensor before he looked at it. The alarm did not sound. No press release was issued that afternoon. No cameras were called. No communications team was notified. The discovery of the Leucadendron grandiflorum specimen was logged in the collection's database with the precise, undramatic language that science uses when it is being most itself. Previously mislabeled specimen correctly identified, reclassified, and transferred to priority cold storage. Original label error traced to 2018 database migration. Specimen in viable condition. Identification made by volunteer catalog during routine review of uncategorized drawer 47. Volunteer cataloging. George had read the log entry James had shown him, because James had correctly judged that he would want to know and had said nothing about the phrasing. He had simply nodded in the way of someone who finds the phrasing exactly right. The following morning, George arrived at his usual time. He changed into his lab coat. He walked to bench 7. Dr. Marsh was already in the lab. She was standing at a bench adjacent to bench 7, not her own bench, not the relocated middle bench, but the one right next to George's. On the bench was a second set of tools, a second loupe, a second pair of tweezers, a second tablet loaded with the cataloging template. George looked at the bench. He looked at Dr. Marsh. He did not say anything. The British instinct for not making a moment more than it needs to be is strong in people who have been raised around palaces and people who have been raised around laboratories. It is, in this way, one of the things they have in common. Dr. Marsh pulled on her gloves. There are still approximately 240 uncategorized specimens in drawer 47, she said, addressing the middle distance rather than George specifically. If we work through them together, we may finish before the end of your placement. Yes, George said, that would be good. He picked up the first envelope from the morning's tray. She picked up the second. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that develops not from an absence of things to say, but from a mutual agreement that the work itself is saying enough. Occasionally, George asked a question. Occasionally, Dr. Marsh answered it, sometimes with a short answer, sometimes with a long one, depending on whether the question was simple or whether it had snagged on something worth pulling. Occasionally, she pointed at something under his loupe and said, "Look at the hilum there." Or, "The testa is thinner on this side. Do you see it?" And George leaned in and looked and either saw it or said honestly that he didn't, and then looked again until he did. The humidity alarm did not sound once. Priya, walking through the lab at mid-morning, slowed to observe the scene at bench 7 for a moment. The senior botanist and the 10-year-old boy, side by side, both bent over their work with the same quality of attention, and felt something she would later describe to her husband as unexpectedly moving, which I know sounds ridiculous. It did not sound ridiculous. James had left a small potted plant on the corner of bench 7 that morning. It was a protea seedling, recently germinated in the glass house, about 4 centimeters tall. It was not labeled. George had looked at it when he arrived and had not asked what it was there for, which suggested he understood. He understood. Colin, the facility's manager, stopped by at 11 to check on the humidity sensor, which had not required checking. He left without saying anything. The biscuit tin appeared on the bench at some point before lunch. Nobody saw who put it there. By the end of the second week, drawer 47 was empty. Dr. Marsh logged the completion in the collection's record. She noted the number of specimens successfully cataloged, 297. She noted the number of mislabeled specimens identified and corrected, 14. She noted the number of specimens requiring priority reclassification, 1. She did not know whose hands had done most of the work on the bottom trays, because the record did not have a field for that, and because she was a scientist and scientists record what the system asks them to record. But she did, that afternoon, do something she had not done in 32 years of working at Kew. She left her desk at lunchtime. She walked to the staff room. She sat down at the table where George and James and Priya and Alistair were eating, and she poured herself a cup of tea from the communal pot, and she pushed the biscuit tin toward George, and she said, without looking up from her tea, "You have a good eye." George took a biscuit. "Thank you," he said. "You have a good eye, too." Alistair, who had not said a voluntary word in the staff room in approximately 4 years, laughed, a short, genuine sound, gone almost before it arrived. It was the best sound the lab had produced all summer. On the last morning of the placement, the garden was still. It was one of those late July mornings that Kew does occasionally, when the air is warm before 9 o'clock, and the light comes through the canopy of the lime avenue at an angle that makes everything look as though it has been slightly gilded. The palm house caught the early sun on its curved glass and sent it back across the lawns in long, bright lines. The wildflower meadow was at full height, humming with insects, indifferent to everything except the business of being itself. George walked through the garden one more time before going to the lab. He walked past the Japanese gateway and the rock garden, and the pond where the water lilies had opened that week for the first time. He stopped for a moment near the water lily house and looked through the glass at the enormous circular leaves floating on the surface of the warm water inside, each one large enough for a child to sit on, which children often did in photographs, with expressions of pure and uncomplicated delight. He walked past the old wall. The wisteria was in its late summer state, the flowers long gone, the leaves dense and dark and settled into the business of the season. The trunk where the vine met the wall was warm from the morning sun. George paused briefly and put his hand against it, not dramatically, not ceremonially, just the way you touch something old when you want to feel that it is real. Then he went inside. In the lab, his bench was clear. He had tidied it the previous afternoon, replaced the tools in their correct positions, filed the last of the data entries, returned the reference manual to the shelf with the spine aligned the way he had found it on the first day. Bench 7 looked the way it had looked before he arrived. If you did not know to look, you would not know he had been there. But drawer 47 was labeled now. Someone, it is not recorded who, though the handwriting, precise and slightly angular, belongs to someone who has been writing in lab books for 30 years, had written a new label for it. Clear, accurate, complete. The drawer that had been a long, untouched silence in the collection was now part of the record. Its contents, all 297 of them, existed in the database with correct names, correct origins, correct classifications. And somewhere in the cold storage facility, in a sealed container at -20°C, a seed that had been lost for the better part of a decade was waiting, as seeds do, for its moment. George spent his last morning in the lab doing something James had suggested at the end of the second week, cross-checking the corrected entries in drawer 47 against the wider database to see if any of the other mislabeled specimens had echoes elsewhere in the collection, other instances of the same error, other quiet losses waiting to be found. He found 3. He logged them. He flagged them for review. He wrote a note in the system. possible pattern in 2018 database migration may be worth checking drawers in same acquisition batch, flagged for staff review. He did not sign the note with his name. The system logged it under his volunteer account number. He packed his canvas bag. He shook hands with James, who managed to hold it together admirably. He said goodbye to Priya, who gave him a Kew tote bag containing a small packet of wildflower seeds and a printed card that read, "Thank you for your careful work," in her neat coordinator's hand. He nodded to Alistair, who nodded back, which between the two of them constituted a warm farewell. He returned his visitor badge to the front desk. Dr. Marsh met him at the staff entrance. She was not holding her clipboard. This was, for those who knew her, a significant detail. She walked with him to the door and they stood for a moment in the morning light, and she said, "The database note about the 2018 migration, that was thorough." "I wasn't sure if it was useful," George said. "It is," she said. "We'll look into it." A pause. "You should come back," she said. It was stated plainly, the way she stated everything, without the softening that would have made it less true. Not as a placement, as someone who has work to do here. George looked at her. "I'd like that." She nodded. She held out her hand. He shook it. And then he walked out through the staff entrance to the plain, dark car waiting on Kew Road, and the door closed and the car pulled away, and the garden was quiet again. The wisteria on the old wall had watched all of it. It has watched everything that has ever happened in this garden, from the planting of the first exotic specimens 200 years ago, to the construction of the great glass houses, to the slow, necessary work of deciding which living things the world cannot afford to lose. It has watched scientists argue over specimens and children press their faces against glass and seed technicians carry boxes to cold storage in the particular careful way of people who understand that what they are carrying is not the thing itself, but the possibility of the thing, not the plant, but the promise of it, waiting in the dark for the right conditions to become what it was always meant to be. Some things take years to bloom. Some things need only one careful pair of eyes to be found. And some visitors, the old vine knows, leave a garden changed, not by the grand gesture or the ceremonial moment, but by the quiet, patient, unremarkable act of doing the work well, and doing it all the way to the bottom of the drawer. The sun moved across the glass of the palm house. The wildflower meadow hummed. Drawer 47 was labeled. And somewhere in the cold, a seed was waiting.